Hello and welcome to the last Bingley Talks Politics episode of 2022, our self-titled review of the year, political review of the year. Some of the big hitting events, some of the main things that happened or had something to do with this year, and we're going to do a whistle-stop tour and then make some predictions for next year, what might happen, what might change, what might not change, or whatever. Right, so I'm joined by Finn. Hello, Finn.
Hello.
Joined by Mr. Cook. Hello, Mr. Cook.
Hello.
And apparently in January, all COVID restrictions ended. I had to go back and check this. We'll do this fairly chronologically, at least for now, until we change our minds. So COVID restrictions ended. Now, we don't want to go on about COVID too much because I'm sensing that's not a real topic that people want to engage with. But one or two things interest me is, I mean, do you think that if something like that happened again, we could do another sort of lockdown, heavy state involvement in our everyday movement?
As in, would people stand for it?
Would they go for it?
As in the government?
Well, would the government do it? No, I mean, will the public? Yeah, will the public go along with it?
I think I'm not too sure. I think the lockdowns. I mean, if you look at the way they were used in China, they were meant to be implemented so you can develop things like test and trace, local lockdowns, things so you'd have to resort to a nationwide one. I don't know if people would stand for it. I think people, because we had a lockdown, but we still had one of the highest death rates in Europe, and on top of that, people by the end of it didn't have great lockdowns. I think people were quite mentally exhausted. I think it'd be interesting.
What do you reckon, Finn? Would we go for it
Yes.
as a people?
It seems difficult, doesn't it? I mean, when I look back on COVID and you think about all the regulations put in place, which, were needed at the time, but you think, well, they were just ridiculous, weren't they? Kind of the ins and outs of them. That kind of feeling of restriction, it feels quite alien now when you look back on it. And I mean, I certainly would not want to go back to it. I mean, if there was another lockdown asked, then I would obey. But
yeah, I just think it's quite an interesting one. We can theorise it a little bit. The role of the individual and the state, how far we would accept state involvement. I think the main questions to ask is when would this be? If it's in the next 3 years, I can't see people just, they can try to do a lockdown. I suppose it's the seriousness of the event. If a new pandemic did start, which looked pretty serious. I think there's little tricks of memory, hindsight, all sorts of things happening here. People looking back at lockdowns and saying, well, there weren't, I was arguing against it. I think Rishi Sunak has suggested this. It's a little bit different when you look at what he did actually argue against. He was with the first lockdown. It's a sense of, right, okay, but so you would actually just not change anything as a killer pandemic is sweeping across the world. It's very difficult to go back and say you would have acted differently, really.
Yeah, and it is a bit annoying when politicians use it as kind of like a point card. They use it as like, well, I oppose this and this and this, and it's like, I get you appealing to like the Tory electorate, so it makes sense to play up the liberty stuff, but just a bit. I don't know. It doesn't sit well with me, that kind of thing.
Yeah, hindsight's a real luxury, and it's lazy to then say, well, we should have done this, could have done that, and I said this and I said that, and it's like, well, yeah, some people did. We're against lockdowns. I think it's interesting. I wasn't. You may be surprised that I didn't tune into Matt Hancock's appearances on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. It's not on my viewing list, that. It's quite popular though, isn't it? He suggested, Hancock, that he was presented with potentially 800,000 deaths with a unchecked virus moving through the population relatively quickly. So those people that would say, and okay, that might not happen exactly to those numbers, but anywhere close to those numbers, that's a image where essentially hospitals and mortuaries can't cope. So it's literally bring out your dead.
Well, forgetting the fact, I've got a friend, I won't name him, but He's very, very anti-lockdown, very, very anti-restrictions. He was very much signed up. He still does sign up to this whole, not herd. He doesn't say herd immunity, but basically he signs up to the idea that we should have shielded the elderly and let everyone else catch it. But it forgets that the NHS prior to COVID was already on the back foot. It was already underfunded. It was already understaffed, and you add on top of that a massively killer pandemic. That even if it's 100,000 dead, not 800,000, that's still enough to completely crack any sort of like hip replacement surgery, cancer scans, anything like that. Immediately gets shut down, right? We saw it in Italy. I think that was probably the main justification in a lot of people's heads.
I think they were quite clear about that, trying
right.
to keep the NHS going. So COVID raises quite a few interesting questions about the nature of individual action, government action. It's just a question of when, really. There will be another pandemic at some point, but let's all hope that it's not that soon. So, we move on chronologically, people. The war in Ukraine, again, this is one that people could talk for hours for, but it's an interesting one. I suppose at the time many people would have predicted the war would be, certainly in its first stage, over by now, but it's not. Ukrainian resistance has been effective, supplied by the West and helped by many NATO countries. What do you think then, the war in Ukraine? It clearly had an impact, hasn't it? We don't need to talk about all the impacts it had, but maybe we could go forward and predict an early prediction here. I mean, will it end next year, Finn, do you think? Is that a possibility?
I mean, there's talk about maybe a stalemate, but then I think fundamentally what happened was Putin went in and he thought, oh, it's going to be bish, bash, bosh. And at first, that first day I remember sitting in my grandma's studio watching it on CNN. At first it looked like Zelensky would be dead by the end of the day. And that hasn't happened because I think Putin didn't realise that Ukrainians lived in Ukraine and they were willing to fight for their country. So, I don't know, I mean, it certainly looks like the force of the nation might well push Putin out, and what happens then, God knows.
Yeah, I think with that, I think it's be careful what you wish for.
Yeah,
because
isn't it?
Let's not go thinking that there's going to be someone who's going to shepherd Russia towards a more lenient democratic system. It could be it could be quite the opposite of that.
Well, Putin's got the big red button, hasn't he?
Yeah,
that's the scary.
I suppose that's another uncertainty, isn't it, about whether there will be bigger, more powerful, potentially nuclear weapons used. Do you think that's likely, Mr. Cook?
I think I can. So at the moment, if we look at the map, they're basically separated by this river. Can't remember the exact name of it. Dnipro, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
And it's separating the forces, and any sort of like small infantry battle, you'll be aware that bridges basically win and lose these wars sometimes. And like you said, Finn, you can see this stalemate almost emerging. Right, one option is that they kind of just attritionally sit down for the winter on both sides of the Dnipro, and they kind of just artillery shell each other, and no one can quite make a counter-attack across. I think when the winter thaws, you're either going to see one or two things. You're either going to see the Ukrainians taking back a lot of territory and pushing forward like we saw in this recent counter-offensive, or you're going to see Russia pull out the big guns, for lack of a better word. There's still a massive amount of weapons they've not used yet. They could. I mean, you don't want to think about what they could actually do if they pulled out everything in the Russian arsenal. But it's getting to the point now, crunch time, right? It'll be in February, it'll be a year since the invasion, which is mad to think. It doesn't feel like a year. And I think what you said, so it's spot on, like, be careful what you wish for, because I think if Putin does get deposed, given how the war's
plenty of
gone,
radical candidates too.
There's plenty of people that will say, well, Putin wasn't radical enough, we should have invaded sooner, we should never have stopped at Crimea, we should have pushed from that point onwards, Putin was weak. That would be terrifying.
So, Putin going may interest many people, but it might not be as positive as people think. You just look at Russian history. You don't have to go back that far, but you can go back as far as you want, really. Russia is not the seedbed of democracy. I think it's fair to say it has turbulence. It's a complicated country to govern. It's a really complicated country to govern, and therefore it's difficult to see any huge progressive steps in that over the next 12 months. I think one thing that might be interesting is negotiation. America stepping on that. Biden's already mentioned that. Putin sort of said, well, only if you recognise that we've got Ukraine, or certainly lots of parts of Ukraine. I think the pressure for that will grow, probably.
Potentially. I mean, I've heard some people with French are quite divided on this. I've heard some people who were quite high up saying that we should be pushing for renegotiation with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what that would look like, and I certainly don't think the West are going to say, okay, you can have as much as you want. I doubt it would do that. But I just think, I don't know, something. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some negotiation with a sort of public front to sort of say the West is asserting itself, possibly, but then Putin might not want that.
Yeah, I
Depends
think
how far it's going to go.
on BBC iPlayer there's this documentary by I've completely forgot his name. Called Trauma Zone anyway.
Adam Curtis.
Adam Curtis,
Yeah.
of
Oh
course.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it applies still to today, because Soviet Union and Russia today, they're like, it's really this perception of this big, bad, evil state that kind of dominate the world. That's what they like you to think. When actually, in reality, Russia's really weak. It's got hardly any. Its economy has been
flatlined at this point.
For 30 years. Its army is a bit dilapidated. I mean, the Russian soldiers in Ukraine, they've got absolutely no morale whatsoever. They don't know why on earth am I fighting here. Half of them have been drafted in, minorities from kind of breakaway regions, and they've got no allegiance to Russia whatsoever. I think Russia is nowhere near as strong as we think it is, although it has got the big bombs.
But it might not matter that much, because it's whether Putin can reckon with that, shape that, get messaging out to the people that actually, because of a few things, they're going to need to accept a deal. His rhetoric doesn't suggest that. In fact, pretty much the opposite. So even though that does make sense, that the West eventually will, this pressure, this over time will maybe cause Russia to buckle a bit more. I don't know whether that will have a big impact on Putin and the direction of the war just yet. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty over Ukraine, and I just don't. Most people would suggest, just for Ukrainians, I hope there's some positivity that comes out of the situation. Right. So the middle of the year, politically, was at least largely, partly, whatever, depending on whether you chose to ignore it, dominated by someone, you might have forgotten him, but it's called Boris Johnson. Yeah, he was Prime Minister, and there was Partygate, there was all sorts of investigations, there was the Sue Gray report, and you may or may not be aware of these things. I mean, ultimately, he ended up very, very reluctantly stepping down, didn't he? I don't know. What do we do here? Let's suggest, how will Boris be remembered? How about we answer that question and then move on?
Not well, I don't think. I mean, he didn't last long at all. I think he came in. Boris, as we know, obviously, from Partygate, he's a quite good liar. And I think Boris had all of the... Sorry, I'm exercising a bias.
In case you can't work out, Finn's not a huge Boris fan. If you're thinking he's been a bit, been a bit equivocal here, yeah. Anyway, no, carry on, Finn.
I mean, he was
carry
marvelled at the start of his term as this great speaker and a great politician, like kind of classic and all that, and he'd last for 10 years, and I mean, it just turned out to be it just wasn't the case, was it? Because Boris showed his true colours, and that is that he's untrustworthy, he lacks integrity, and then we saw that in Partygate, and then his government imploded in the most spectacular way a government has ever imploded.
So when Finn writes Johnson's biography, Mr. Cook, it's not going to be glowing.
Are you
the same? Not big impacts? No? Yes? Sometimes? Some of it?
I actually think there's a chance that he's going to be forgotten by most people, weirdly enough. I think when I was during lockdown, I remember I came up with... Because obviously he likes to compare himself to Churchill. And I actually think a better comparison is David Lloyd George. I think David Lloyd George, if you ignore his immensely great organisational skill, Lloyd George, which is a good strength, right, in terms of reorganising our war effort after Asquith's downfall, he then went on to lose the premiership over massive scandals.
Yeah, it was mired in corruption and controversy,
he was
wasn't
making
it?
money off of these honours. And if you ask most people now, and Lloyd George then went on to dominate the Liberal Party in the 20s and 30s, right? Institutionally, it was his machine, basically. But you ask people who Lloyd George is today, and a lot of people just won't know. And it's weird, because it's the same, in my opinion, with Ted Heath, who took us into the EEC. If you ask my generation, a lot of them, who's Ted Heath, what did he do? They have absolutely no clue. But doing something as momentous as taking us into the EEC, you'd expect him to be remembered, wouldn't you? And Boris, like you said, Finn, if you look at his actual record, besides Brexit, which obviously some people will love, and they'll look back on that, quite well, but besides Brexit, what did he accomplish? Right, he saw us through COVID, the Ukraine war thing. I guess you can kind of, he's got that he holds up all the time, doesn't he? He's made that into his issue, kind of.
Well, okay, so I'll put the case for the defence. Brexit, a significant election win for the Conservatives, got Brexit done. Response to COVID, particularly with vaccination. I mean, obviously you can argue how much Johnson was responsible for this, but he is Prime Minister. He will clearly, certainly himself, suggest that there's a big impact. And then the war in Ukraine. I mean, okay, I think the war in Ukraine is the most impressive, personally, out of all those. I think he actually did a pretty good job there. I thought it was instinctive. I think he likes that. I think that it releases foreign policy, allows people mired in domestic problems. It releases them, doesn't it, a bit? We've seen this before with several leaders. It releases them, and they can act differently. They don't have that, they're not actually trying to please a particular base, if you like. It generally doesn't win elections, foreign policy. However, I think probably one thing that he seemed to get the tone right. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He was quick with a response. He's been quite committed. Yeah, there were a few PR opportunities, but which leader doesn't use that? So that would be the thing that I think has got some potential to say, well, actually, it did pretty well there. And then it depends how much you link the Prime Minister to other things that happened. I think we've got to perhaps get out of leaders just obsessing about election results, because that's just like the first step, isn't it? It's like, yes, and now you've got to govern. It's not just about winning elections, and we know that elections don't secure democracy anyway, necessarily, do they? They're only a feature of it. So, yeah, so your book, Mr Cook's going to be Lloyd George, Heath and Johnson, the Prime Ministers who everyone's forgotten.
Yeah, you can probably think better case than this, maybe. But I think the idea that he's going to be remembered and hailed, I think, is quite. I think give it 70 years, people literally, it might only be known by like political anoraks, and that's it basically.
Well, that'd be interesting. It would be interesting. It's quite an interesting exercise when we go around. Clearly some Prime Ministers live large in people's memory, whether they're interested in politics or not. Some don't. The Queen died on September the 8th. My daughter's birthday, so I do remember. So early September, the Queen died. Now, obviously, there was loads of stuff about this at the time. Let's try and sum this up to say, will the royal family last? Will it need to change more? Does it? She was such a long reign, and impressive in so many ways. Whether you're a Republican or monarchist, or what. It's a very different thing, isn't it, now, that many people had respect or just accepted or hugely liked her. There was a lot of people saying very, very good things about her. Will the monarchy be here in 30 years? Or am I overstating that particular case? What do we think on that?
I think kind of for the monarchy has always been kind of a symbolic thing for the UK, hasn't it? Americans like to think that we're all princes and princesses, and that's just kind of their thing anyway. But I think the problem is that with the Queen going, the Queen was that symbolic head. She was kind of that continuity through the ages. Whereas now, I feel like Charles has obviously been embroiled in all of this royal scandal, Diana, all of that. I feel like the Queen going, it's sort of, she was the last part of the old monarchy, and now it's the soap opera. Yeah. Now it's the reality.
Well, you might be rushing home to watch the next instalment of Harry and Meghan.
I will be.
Netflix.
Me and my mum are ardent Republicans, but we still watch.
Have you watched some of this?
Yeah.
I've only seen the. I wouldn't mind. I could sit through an episode and see what you've got to say. It does sound quite explosive stuff if that's your, thing.
Yeah, I won't watch it. I mean, it's not. I mean, I am a monarchist. I'll get my credentials out now, but it's nothing. I'm not watching it. I mean, I can't do reality
He's not
TV.
wearing a monarchist T-shirt.
I'm not, but I did wear black ties.
There you go.
Do you remember?
There you go.
Right?
Yeah,
I was
you
wearing
did.
black
Yeah.
ties every day.
You know how to behave, Mr. Cook.
I do indeed. I do indeed.
Decorum to proceedings.
Tradition.
Very good. Very good.
But I remember when we did the episode on that, you made a good point, which was that Elizabeth, I don't know how to refer to her now. Liz, there we go, Lizzie. She embodified not only, she managed to convey this neutrality, this being above the fray thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you would never ever see the Queen get egged in public on a walkabout. So it shows, doesn't it, that it's not so much the institution itself that people risk. Because Charles is now getting egged left, right and centre whenever he goes out on a walkabout.
He'll never have that.
He'll never will it.
Maybe no one would. I don't know. Yeah, it's personality dependent, isn't it? I mean, yeah, she had a way. I think we underestimate how much thought she put into it. I don't think it was by accident. I think she was an effective leader of the royal machine, if not necessarily, the state or anything like that. I think it's just interesting. I'm not suggesting the royal family's going anywhere. It's an institution that many British people like. I just think it needs to move with the times. It needs to work out what it's about. It needs to be relevant. It could be, but I think it needs to do those things to avoid being, because it could be just decline by just becoming a bit obscure. It's like, well, who are they? Oh yeah, the royal family. They used to be a big thing around here, but they're not so much anymore. But we still. It could. I don't know. I don't think that. I think they'll still be here this time next year. But I just think, yeah, how relevant can they remain? Okay, let's wrap a couple of things up and then link to these predictions. So next on my list, it's we're speaking of prime ministers who everyone might forget. I don't know, Liz Truss. I mean, she'd be a quiz question, won't she? The shortest serving of a prime minister. So if let's not do lots on Liz Truss because for various reasons. Rishi Sunak is prime minister now. So he became prime minister fairly recently. Will he still be here in 1 year's time? December 2023. Who's going first on this one? Will it still be Sunak as PM?
Probably.
Probably.
Yes, it will. Probably. There seems to be, I think for various reasons, it's very unlikely an election will happen. So unless something that just seems relatively unpredictable at the moment, Sunak will stay.
Yeah, I think you don't get the same sense, do you, when Liz Truss came in and she was in for about 20 days, and then you already saw the backbenches and the rustling of the leaves and stuff. Rishi seems to there's a lot of discontent with certain aspects of him, I think. There's this whole onshore wind farm thing.
Yeah, well, let's take that then. Will he started off in a fairly weak position. You might argue, some people, that he's added a bit of stability. They're maybe just sizing each other up, Sunak and Starmer. Parties are moving and thinking about elections as we go through next year. Will he be in a stronger or weaker position? How will Sunak be doing in 1 year's time?
Right, I think Sunak's a bit of a John Major, really. I think the economy, I don't think Sunak has the political capital to be able to kind of turn things round in a positive direction. I think Sunak's role in history will just be making sure things don't collapse again and just getting us through to that next election, where Labour will, as it looks, it will probably win, or if Sunak...
We don't have to predict that yet, because that's not come up. We don't think that's going to be an election. Yeah, we don't think it's going to be an election next year.
But I think Sunak, he doesn't really have the kind of unity in his...
So you're thinking, Finn, that he won't be in any stronger a position than he is now if he is in a strong position?
I think he's just a placeholder to like a...
Mr Cook, are you in agreement with that?
I think it depends, doesn't it, how events play out for him. I mean, you've got three areas. You've got how he gets through this winter with the strikes and whether he actually manages to allow people's lives to retain some semblance of normality and people don't feel hit by it, then that's a plus for him, right? But like you said, the economy's not looking great, and I think he's played away all of his cards to an extent. He had a chance when he came in to kind of say, right, all of Liz Truss's people out. This is my people now. I've got an agenda. I'm going to push radical policies through. That necessarily tax cuts and all that stuff. But he kept someone like Jeremy Hunt. Now, Jeremy Hunt is, I associate him with the austerity cuts of the 2010 era. I know
relatively, certainly with the people who he was, certainly with NHS staff, not a hugely popular health secretary. Relatively long-serving, but not...
Well, there is no, but he could have got, I mean, he could have brought in someone that, Mel Stride, for instance.
He's played quite safe, hasn't he?
He's played it too safe.
He's played it safe, and I suppose you say suggesting maybe a bit more of a gamble.
He needs to come
or
out.
A bolder move might serve him better.
What does he stand for, despite cutting debt? I actually don't know, and that's not going to win you an election 10 years after you were elected to cut the debt in the first place.
Unlikely.
So
we think Sunak has got a difficult year, but he's there. He's got the opportunity, hasn't he, to make the best of what will be. I think Britain will be in a better place this time next year because we've got we're out of the World Cup, and on top of that, there's for recent times there's record inflation, there's high inflation, there's a cost of living crisis, there's strikes, there's problems.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be in a better position. I'll be frank. I think we're going to be in a worse position next winter.
We're not spreading much festive cheer here.
No, you
can't. You've got to tell it how it is. Yeah.
I think I was personally hoping that when Rishi became Prime Minister, we'd at least see some sort of like crisis management or some like taking stuff quite seriously, like risks. So, I mean, one prediction: I think there are going to be blackouts this winter in the country. I think there are going to be areas of Britain with blackouts. Because no one in government's talking about energy rationing or energy storage and stuff, building up our battery reserves. No one's talking about this stuff. It's all about migrant crossings and COP and World Cups and all this stuff, right? No one's actually discussing strategic risks to us.
Finn, are you any more positive?
That sounds fun.
You're Come on, give us the younger, more optimistic view. Oh no, give us what you tell us how you see it.
You can only hope that things get better. And
Hope.
I think
hope's important. Yeah.
I mean, things will get better eventually. They will. I mean, that's
yeah.
Just how
and let's look at one of the greatest American presidents, FDR. The only thing to fear is fear itself. A great line, and quite resonant a number of times, but potentially now. You can look a crisis in the eye and say, "Come on, This is what happens. This is the world. This is life. This is." Bad stuff happens too. Yes, you might argue we can't get out. People are feeling affecting people's lives, absolutely. But what's the alternative? Got to grip it and get on with it and make the best of it. So yeah, it could happen, couldn't it? Could happen. Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a positive.
He also says in his inauguration speech, right? He says something about how if the current powers of the executive aren't enough, we're going to have to rearrange government and the executive, and we're going to have unprecedented wartime powers to tackle this crisis. Where is that attitude among our politicians in Britain right now? Who's coming out and giving such a rousing
They're probably
speech?
afraid there were COVID with that, I reckon. I see what you mean, yeah, rousing speech. Well, I don't know. Not sure who can do that. But
I think it comes back to the fact that Sunak doesn't really, then again, have that political capital to put his foot down and say what he wants. I think he's too weak.
Which is strange, because I would suspected when he got in he would have a lot more, because he was seemingly correct about the trust cuts, right?
Yeah.
But it seemed that the Tory party didn't like the fact that he was right.
Interesting. Read an account of the end of Boris Johnson, which kind of, most, if you followed it, most of the events. What really did for Boris Johnson in the end, Partygate, yes, not telling the truth sometimes, leaving bits out, yes, Sue Gray or whatever came of that. However, he couldn't rely on his party. He never really... OK, some new MPs were loyal to him, but he never really... The job of Prime Minister is a party leader as well, and you've got to get a grip of the majority of your party. You've got to understand the party, you've got to lead the party, you've got to be in charge of that party. Johnson struggled with that. He struggled to really convince elements, and he couldn't grip it. And in the end, they quickly unravelled. And it was that arguably pushed him out.
Yeah, didn't he get an abnormally small amount of support from the MPs?
Yeah.
His leadership contest with Jeremy Hunt, right?
And then on his vote of confidence, he got fewer than Theresa May. Fewer votes than Theresa May.
Membership, right? That was what put him there.
Yeah.
But there's obviously a disconnect between.
You've got to manage your MPs, and Sunak will be aware of that. Might find that tricky. So one final prediction. Let's go America's nice at Christmas time, apparently. So let's go over there and let's say, this time next year, are we looking at the preparations for Biden versus Trump?
I think now it's more likely to be Ron DeSantis now. I think there's a really good chance we're going to see Biden.
So Mr. Cook
DeSantis.
calling no Trump.
I don't think there is. I don't think there's going to be a Trump.
So
I think
won't.
DeSantis will be
When
the
will
next Republican candidate.
all the primaries start? It's usually.
So apparently DeSantis is announcing his campaign in March next year. Apparently early 2023 is when you're going to see all these Republican candidates.
Yeah,
Like
I mean, the
Mike
primaries
Pence.
don't start for a while, do they? But
No.
then they're a drawn out process.
Yeah, they are. And you've got. I don't think they're side by side. I think
No.
isn't it?
No, yeah, yeah. It takes ages. Oh, it takes a while. So the other people will come out, and that'll be interesting. What are you saying on Trump, Finn?
It might be Trump versus Biden, or if Biden dies, then which is a very real possibility.
Well, it's not an impossibility, yeah.
And who knows? I mean, I think it'll, but I think I agree with you. It's more likely to be Ron DeSantis. I think Trump might run as an independent, though.
I think Trump's done. I think there's there's too many things playing against him, but who knows? He is unpredictable. There are certain, not rules, but certain things though that need to go in his favour for him, and I just think that might not work out for him.
He's not actually very good at politics, Trump.
No, he's made strategic errors.
Yeah.
People blaming him, and also the Murdoch pulling out and saying, "Well, actually, no, you keep saying that you're a winner, but we brand you as a bit of a loser. You keep losing, and we don't want to be linked with a loser. If he doesn't have those big networks on his side, and they fancy somebody else, and there's often DeSantis is becoming more well known, but is still relatively unknown beyond Florida and some of the main news in America. He could be that. There's a little bit of fanfare about him, and people tend to go with them. Like they did with Obama. I think the more equally as interesting is the Democrats can't find anyone to sort of say, well, we've got an alternative to Biden, because we do realise he's going to be 82 in the next election, and not saying that he can't do a job when he's 82, but blimey, 86 when he potentially, if he won, and I mean that's so that's an interesting one, isn't it? I'm going to predict no Trump, probably Biden. Probably, and we'll see how that goes.
Well, AOC, I think. I don't get why the Democrats aren't pushing her to run against Biden. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the young.
Yeah.
I think she's young, she's quite radical. As long as
let's keep an eye, you never know.
Yeah.
Someone needs to come out and press their case. I don't know whether they are.
It's whether people feel confident within the party to challenge Biden, right? And whether that feels a bit disrespectful on on some people's parts in the movement.
And I suppose the other thing with America, I don't think whether it'll happen this year, is any more Supreme Court action and the potential civil unrest. So there you go. End on a really buoyant note.
Civil unrest.
But Christmas brings many people, be cheerful, despite perhaps inclement political weather. There you go. Quick review of the year there. Did quite well, I think. And a few predictions. And what we're going to do next year is try a new innovation. We have a very innovative team here. Some sort of bite-sized, shorter versions of this podcast to see if we can get more people on board. So, Merry Christmas, Mr. Cook.
Merry Christmas, Mr. Boo.
Merry Christmas, Finn.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, all of you. And over and out.